All right, today we're going to be talking about the rise of U.S. imperialism and the shift from U.S. kind of economic policy of gaining entrance into Latin American economies and Latin American nations, and that transition toward real hardcore military imperialism that the U.S. will start to go through in the 1890s, and will follow it through to the 19 teens through the Panama Canal. This is also a period that many historians have called Europe's new imperialism in the late 1800s, when they suddenly started conquering many new colonies throughout the world, largely in Africa and East Asia. So we'll take a minute to explain the difference between old imperial styles that Europeans had used since at least the 1500s, and what really changes in the 1800s that feeds into this so-called new level of imperialism that the U.S. will eventually get into in the 1890s. So there's several kind of causes that historians have identified for the quote new imperialism. One thing that we should remember is that the new imperialism does not mean that Europe is starting to be imperial. The Europeans have gone imperial since at least the 1500s, when the Spanish and Portuguese started conquering major parts of the Americas. So this so-called new imperialism is just a new wave of imperialism that gets going in the late 1800s. Europeans had really slowed down the growth of their colonies and conquering new places after 1815, but that picks up again after 1871, largely after Germany is united into one singular country in 1871. So one of the major causes is one thing that we talked about previously. It's called social Darwinism. This idea that there is a international survival of the fittest, survival of the fittest nation or the fittest government. And this idea that kind of takes hold in the late 1800s in kind of European intellectual circles basically says that if a country or a government is not efficient or growing or powerful, then by default it is not efficient, it is weaker, it is slower, and is therefore kind of open to being conquered itself. So this idea of survival of the fittest government or survival of the fittest country convinced a lot of the major leading powerful countries in the world, especially in Europe, to start going after new colonies in order to increase the amount of markets or resources or whatever strategic position they're trying to get in the world. The belief that getting those kind of colonies will bring wealth or power to one of the European colonizing powers around the world. So you see a quick growth and a kind of frenzied race for colonies that gets going in the late 1800s as, say, for example, if Germany wants to go out and start conquering new colonies, then the British or the French or the Russians or whoever else will look at that saying to themselves, well, the Germans are strengthening their international position by getting more colonies, so the best way we can combat that and to survive this type of race is to go conquer colonies for ourselves to also improve our national income or our national profit margin or balance of trade or whatever you want to call it. Because if we fall too far behind those governments that are on the cutting edge, then they will eventually get so far out ahead of us that they will maybe be able to dominate us in the future. So when one country starts colonizing certain areas of the world, that will kind of start off this crazy race for colonies amongst the other big imperial powers. So this idea of social Darwinism kind of starts Europeans down this kind of systematic step-by-step thought process. Another big cause that historians have identified is just general nationalism, just kind of patriotism or belief in a certain national greatness. Like the French believe that France is the greatest country ever, the British believe Britain's the greatest country ever, on and on and on. So in the late 1800s, a lot of intellectuals and political leaders start talking about how national greatness or national strength is defined by the ability to spread the great things your country has accomplished. say scientifically or intellectually or in material innovations or the Industrial Revolution or art or whatever. The ability to not just enjoy that in your home country, but to spread the benefits of this growing civilization, this growing scientific knowledge to all the corners of the globe that may not have heard of it yet, is kind of one way of defining a national greatness or your own national strength. So that's another big cause that historians have identified for why Europeans will go out and start trying to colonize other places so quickly in the late 1800s. Yet another is just industrialization all by itself. Industrialization leads to the scientific innovations and revolution, industrial revolution, and sometimes leads to a lot of the philosophical and intellectual and artistic movements that Europeans get into in the late 1800s that they're going to try to spread to the rest of the world. But industrialization itself makes the imperialism easier, because before industrialization, if a country like, say, Britain wants to go out and conquer and colonize some part of the world that might have a large population, say, for instance, India, that's a really difficult thing to do because Britain doesn't have a giant population, and to have Britain being a fairly small population trying to control India, which has a huge population, you basically have to do it with a lot of soldiers. And if you don't have a lot of soldiers in your own country to do that, you have to pay mercenaries. You have to give them a bunch of guns. You have to give them training and funding. You have to give them supplies. So keeping a large imperial army is very expensive to keep them all over the world to control colonies before the 1800s. And you had to have a big military there because the weaponry before the 1800s was basically what we think of as front-loading muskets, which means that you would, if you're a soldier, you would show up to a battlefield. If the people that are colonized get angry and they rise up and start a revolt, you go out to the battlefield to end the revolt, to fight a battle. And you as a soldier, you shoot your gun, and you're trained to immediately start reloading your gun, which means you take the bullet and you put it in its place, you pack some gunpowder down in through the barrel of the gun, you set a flint, you have to go through these many kind of intricate steps, and you hope to do it in about 45 seconds or a minute or so, and be able to reload your gun and shoot it again before the enemy can run up to you and basically knock your head off. So it's a race against time. So your army is hoping to shoot enough bullets at the enemy to prevent them from physically getting to you, because usually these colonized areas, they don't have a lot of guns themselves, so they're still fighting with swords or spears or axes or whatever handheld implements they have. So they're usually fighting with ancient technology. So these front-loading muskets take a long time to reload. So your army's best hope is just to be well trained enough to keep reloading your guns and keep shooting enough bullets to prevent the enemy from getting to you and being able to hit you with whatever weapon they have. That changes quite a lot after the Industrial Revolution because industrialization created much faster reloading guns. They start inventing a cartridge for a rifle, which packs all the gunpowder and the flint and everything into one bullet as we know of it today, where all you have to do is put that bullet, that cartridge, into the gun and fire it, and you can put another bullet in within maybe 10 seconds and fire it. So the amount of bullets that can be shot at the enemy that are charging greatly increases because the industrial weaponry have so dramatically reduced the time it takes to reload. And that's even before you get, in the very late 1800s, into machine guns and much more powerful cannon that can reload automatically, basically. It's basically a machine rifle that reloads itself almost instantaneously. So industrialized armies in the late 1800s have much more firepower, much more reloading power, and therefore can fire an infinitely larger amount of bullets at any invading or attacking colonized revolutionary army. And that means that Europeans don't have to keep as large of an army stationed in a colony in order to control that colony. If in the 1700s the British had to have just, I don't know, an example, 100,000 troops in India in order to control India, with the old, very slowly reloading guns, they might only have to hold 10,000 troops in all of India with machine guns, because their firepower has so dramatically increased. So industrialization itself makes imperialism and colonization easier to accomplish, because their military firepower is so much more extreme, and they have such a huge just firepower advantage over any native colonized indigenous group. That's just much easier to control them militarily. So that's another reason we see a huge new wave of so-called new imperialism in the late 1800s, when those advances in firepower become very, very pronounced. And again, all of these three factors set off a frenzied race for colonies, especially after 871, when Germany is unified into one solid country. Before 1871, Germany for hundreds of years had been separated into several hundred different countries, depending on exactly what year you're talking about. So we're going to start seeing, especially in the 1870s, 1880s, European colonization taking off all over the globe again. And one of the big continents that they really go after is Africa. So we see on this map, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, how much area of the African continent that the Europeans had colonized by 1884, mostly along the periphery, along the coastlines. But in the larger map, by around the year 1920, 1910 or so, you see that the Europeans have colonized and controlled basically the whole continent outside of the Sahara Desert, which is one of the largest and most uninhabitable deserts on the face of the earth. So because of these advantages that the Europeans have in the late 1800s over indigenous Africans, colonization takes off, and they colonize virtually all of the inhabitable land possible that they can find within just a few decades. We also see this going on in South Asia, where the British have owned and controlled most of India since the mid-1700s, but they expand their control into neighboring provinces around India. We also see this happening in East Asia, where China has not really undergone the Industrial Revolution yet, and so the European powers generally start carving out pieces of China for themselves. And we see on this map that there are several different major powers that have, taken advantage of China and have basically carved colonies out of China by about 1910. And this is where we're going to start to see the big kind of transition as the United States will start to get involved. The United States becomes interested, especially in China, because the United States doesn't have a problem with gaining more land. The United States has, by the mid-1900s, has conquered all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The United States is far larger than any individual European country, except for maybe Russia. The United States itself has more land mass than all of Europe combined, if you exclude Russia. So the big problem for the United States in the late 1800s is not really lack of territory or lack of raw resources. The main U.S. problem is really economic. The United States has gone into the Industrial Revolution and has started mass industrialization since 1865. And the big U.S. economic problem is that its Industrial Revolution was so powerful and so efficient in the late 1800s that its factories were able to produce more goods than the American population needed. The people of the United States did not need and could not afford to buy all the products that the U.S. factories were already churning out. Businesses being what they are, they produce way more than is necessary, so they flood the market with goods hoping to make money. And whenever, if you've ever studied economics, you have a kind of problem with what we call supply and demand. Whenever the market is oversupplied, it means that they've made more of a specific good than the market wants. So demand pretty much stays the same, but with oversupply, you basically crash the prices because companies have stockpiles of this stuff sitting in warehouses that they can't sell because people don't need anymore. So what do? They start offering discount prices, which lowers the price of the good at the market, and that collapses the price of all those goods in all stores virtually all over the country. And that tends to cause layoffs in factories and in warehouses because companies are making less money off their product than they had anticipated, so they go into layoffs. And that's really the cause of most major U.S. recessions in the late 1800s, what we today call recessions. Back then they called them financial panics. So companies went bankrupt, they laid off entire workforces, and that could start a major economic national downturn. And that was the big U.S. economic problem in the late 1800s. Their factories were overproducing for the market and crashing the U.S. economy. And it happened in cycles over and over again in the late 1800s. So the big idea that many U.S. leaders and especially business interests hit on was not to kind of slow down their industrial production. And if anything, they want to produce faster and produce more goods. So their idea instead was to increase demand. And the way they wanted to do that was to get their goods into China, because China already had the world's largest population. So it was said amongst the business elite that if you can just get these goods, these overproduced goods, out of the U.S. market and into China, there's more Chinese people than Americans, and they will never stop buying. And so companies can keep producing as much as they want with a virtually endless customer base if you can access China. And that becomes basically U.S. foreign policy, to figure out how to get these goods to China. The problem, though, if you're looking at the map, is that the United States is fairly far from China, some 7,000 miles away. And that's a long, long boat ride to get goods across the Pacific Ocean all the way to China. And boats back then ran on coal. So no boat could hold enough coal with the goods that they want to also sell in China and to fuel the boat to get it to drive all the way to China. So what the United States government and business interests realized is that they were going to need what they called coaling stations, little island stops in between from the United States going west toward China. And the United States government policy became in the 1880s to figure out which of these islands along the way would be the best places for the U.S. government to somehow control, to basically set up what we would think of today as gas stations. Like if you want to drive from LA to San Francisco, you can't do that on one tank of gas. You got to stop somewhere in between and refill and resupply. And that's exactly what the U.S. is thinking about. They want to control these little way stations, these little refueling stations, somewhere along the route to China. And eventually, different U.S. leaders start picking out different islands, and they each have their different projects. And eventually, the first one that they really go after is Hawaii. Hawaii was an independent country. It was a monarchy of native Hawaiians. And U.S. businesses, as we've talked about before, had gone into Hawaii and bought up some land. And the big thing in Hawaii for U.S. businesses was sugar. So they started growing lots of sugar in Hawaii and eventually started a revolt in 1893 that overthrew the native Hawaiian monarchy and established basically a provincial government, basically run by U.S. business interests, the U.S. sugar growers, and eventually decided to take a vote to make themselves part of the United States. So that's how the United States gained control over Hawaii. So the revolt happened in 1893, and the United States government takes formal control of Hawaii as a territory in 1898. But that's just the first island system that they want to control to create this way station. They'll later go off, you can see on the map, going further west and go after Midway Island, what becomes known as Wake Island, and then Guam. And then the last stop toward China is to try to control a few islands in the Philippines and then get into China itself. So that was U.S. foreign policy in the late 1800s for the Pacific. And it is completely business driven. It is economically driven. There's some other major kind of theories floating around that kind of justify these types of moves. One of them is actually put out by a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, and his big theory that he starts talking about, he writes it up basically in a journal article, and he starts going around the country giving speeches and whatnot. His big kind of catchphrase is that the frontier is closed. So his historical theory, if we go back to the map, is that the United States, since its inception as the early 13 colonies, started off on the eastern seaboard, New York, Boston, those types of places, and that all of U.S. history was driven by a westward demand to get more land. So he says that was the driving force of U.S. politics, of U.S. history, to keep going further and further west, gobbling up more land. Once the United States becomes a country in the late 1700s, turning that land into states. And he says that was the great goal of the 1800s, get more land, get Louisiana Territory, get Texas, get all the way to the Pacific. And in I think it was the 1860s, the United States bought Alaska from Russia, so Alaska becomes another giant territory. But by the 1890s, the United States has accomplished all that, and that's where Jackson comes in and says, the frontier is closed, we've got to the ocean. So he asked, what is going to be the next great phase of U.S. history now that they've gobbled up all the land they can possibly get going west? And one prediction he made is basically that the next focal kind of point for the next phase of U.S. history is to go out into the ocean and start gobbling up islands. So that's one kind of intellectual theory that's floating around out there that kind of justifies a lot of this stuff. Jackson's idea that the frontier is closed. Another one is put out by a member of the U.S. Navy, one of the kind of high leaders of the U.S. Navy, who also writes books for a living. And in 1890, he wrote basically a history of world power, kind of a history book that had a different chapter on all the major powers throughout all of Western civilization history. And the connections he drew to all those powers is that each of those powers built and relied on a gigantic navy to achieve its strength, its national power, its influence over foreign places. So he called it the theory of sea power. And he argued at the end of that book that if the United States wants to be one of the next great world powers in the 1900s, that it should start building up its navy on a massive scale in order to control its dual coastlines. Again, if we go back to the map, its eastern coastline, the eastern cities, Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., but now also its western coastline, San Francisco, Los Angeles, even thinking about Alaska. And he says that you're also going to need a way to move your navy from coast to coast in case of attack, but also to spread your influence, U.S. influence, into the Pacific and keep going west. So those are two major kind of intellectual justifications for a lot of what the United States is going to start doing in the Pacific, and that'll also have results for Latin America. So that's kind of U.S. background. That's what a lot of Americans are thinking in the late 1800s. There's also other things going on in Latin America in the late 1800s. One of the big ones is a Cuban Revolution that started in 1868. We need to remember that Cuba and Puerto Rico are still Spanish colonies in the late 1800s. A lot of people that live in Cuba every once in a while start talking about a revolution against Spain to make Cuba into an independent country, just like most of the rest of Latin America. And that kind of talk gets going into an independence movement and eventually a revolution that starts in 1868 that becomes pretty powerful. It becomes multiracial. It is a revolution of workers and also big landowners. So it's a kind of cross-class rebellion against Spain to create Cuba as an independent country. But Spain eventually sent enough troops in to Cuba to defeat the revolutionaries and force Cuba to remain a Spanish colony. And that revolution ended in 1878, so it took Spain 10 years, but they eventually won. In the years after 1878, a lot of U.S. businesses started going into Cuba and buying land, investing in property, starting to buy up sugarcane fields and other resources and whatnot. And so the United States businesses and elite and even the U.S. government start taking an increasing interest in Cuba after that revolution failed. And the United States even offered to flat out buy Cuba from Spain at one point, but Spain turned down the offer. So Cuba is kind of moving along into the 1880s. The big debates, political debates in Cuba in the 1880s is basically over slavery. Spain still allows slavery in Cuba. So a lot of these kind of revolutionary type people start getting involved more increasingly politically to end slavery, and Cuba will do that kind of step by step up through 1886, where they finally end all slavery on the island completely. And that seems to have kind of kicked off a lot of Cuban people thinking about, well, if we can unify to end slavery and accomplish that giant change for our society, then possibly we can start a new revolt. And a lot of these talks are led by a lawyer and a poet named Jose Marti. And he starts getting kind of leaders and investors together. And eventually they start a new independence movement in 1895. So Marti is probably the most famous leader of it, and person who kind of published justifications for how great it would be if Cuba was an independent country. This revolutionary movement got quite a lot of help from Cuban exiles living in the United States, raising money, sending supplies, these types of things. The Revolutionary War against Spain basically became a guerrilla war that the Spanish government used or had to send in troops to try to defeat. The guerrillas would go off and hide in the mountains, basically, and the Spanish government thought that its only real recourse, its only real solution to this, was to start forcing the civilian population to move around in order to force the guerrillas out of hiding, so that the Spanish troops could basically attack and destroy the revolutionary movement. But a lot of the Cuban people obviously didn't like being forced to move by the Spanish government, so they start talking pretty openly about being oppressed and how the Spanish government is so horrible and it's a tyranny and all these types of things. And that gets a lot of hearing in the United States. A lot of U.S. citizens are very upset at what Spain is doing in Cuba, and these stories make it into newspapers. A lot of the U.S. business interests are very angry at the Spanish government. They feel that they're under attack, and they're worried about having their property and their investments taken away from them. And eventually this kind of reaches all the way up to U.S. political leaders who start getting drawn in because reporters asked them, what are you going to do about Cuba? What's your opinion about Cuba? U.S. support for the Cuban Revolution really broke down into three general types of statements. A lot of American people in the U.S. were very kind of sincerely supportive of a Cuban revolution because they really thought that the Spanish government was, running a tyranny against Cuba, and saw a lot of similarities to what the British had done to the colonists that started the American Revolution. So there were others in the United States who said that not only should the Cubans have their own country, the Spanish are evil, but the United States should support a Cuban revolution because the United States was one of the first to, rise up against a European tyranny and overthrow tyranny, and that the United States should lead other Latin American countries in doing the same. So there's like the second group that want Cuba to be an independent country and actively want the United States to get involved in helping accomplish that goal. And then there's a third kind of group who want to go in and help the Cubans in this revolution, but mostly want to do it just to enrich themselves. They see the Cuban Revolutionary War as a kind of investment opportunity for their own U.S.-based businesses, or they have some other kind of personal gains in mind. So a lot of these kind of conflicts and ideas kind of float up to the highest levels of the U.S. government. The U.S. president at the time that the revolution breaks out is a guy named Cleveland in 1885. Or 1895, I'm sorry. He's been U.S. president since 1893. He is not very popular by 1895 because the United States is mired in really the biggest economic downturn in its history. So the United States economy is doing pretty badly at that point, and people are blaming President Cleveland like crazy. Cleveland's kind of response to Cuba is that's happening somewhere else. The U.S. has enough problems to deal with all by itself with this economic catastrophe. So Cleveland's general statement is not interested in Cuba. We're not getting involved there. But he's so unpopular that his own party doesn't even nominate him again for re-election in 1896. So he's going to be out of office, and pretty much everybody knows it. The winner of the 1896 election, named William McKinley, gets inaugurated, so he becomes president in March of 1897. And when he enters office, he tries to negotiate with the Spanish government, and his stance is to try to convince the Spanish to accept that even if Cuba remains a Spanish colony, that the Cubans should be allowed to elect their own leaders and have some amount of autonomy to make their own laws and have their own police forces and whatnot. So that's what McKinley is hoping to accomplish. McKinley is basically on the fence. He doesn't want a full-scale war. He doesn't want the U.S. to get involved in something like that. But he doesn't want to just do nothing. He wants to kind of show that he's some great American leader to accomplish something for Cuba. The problem, though, is that the Spanish government leaders, there's no way they're going to allow Cuba to become any more autonomous than they already are, because in Spain, people in Spain look at Cuba as like the last colony that the Spanish have. That's a very last holdover from their great American empire that they had in the 1500s, where they basically dominated the Americas. So a lot of Spanish people look at it as Cuba is like the last piece that Spain still owns. And it's a matter of pride for a lot of Spanish people to still have Cuba as a colony. So any Spanish government leader who negotiates to allow for more Cuban autonomy or even independence, they're going to get voted out of office in the next election. They all know it. So the Spanish government takes a hard stand. There's no way they're going to allow Cuba to become independent or to have any more kind of freedom or rights or democracy than they already have. So McKinley's negotiations basically go nowhere in 1897. And at the end of 1897, very late in the year, riots start breaking out in Havana, the biggest city in Cuba. And it appears that the Spanish are just losing control over Cuba completely. The Spanish government can't even stop the riots. So President McKinley, in order, he says, to protect U.S. businesses based in Havana, he sends a U.S. warship, the USS Maine, into Havana Harbor as basically a show of force. It's a symbolic act to send a U.S. warship into the harbor to basically let the rioters know and let the Cuban people know in general that the United States is not going to sit by and watch its business interests destroyed in Cuba. But as that ship is sitting in Havana Harbor, supposedly sending that message, it suddenly explodes one day, a couple months later in February of '98. It appears that it's some type of internal explosion, and the U.S. press really goes nuts with this. Publishes extreme kind of pictures and all these depictions, and you can see this is a newspaper headline from New York. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. So there's all kinds of paranoia and anger, and McKinley himself starts publicly saying that he believes that Spanish spies had gotten onto the U.S. Maine and had detonated some kind of explosive to destroy the thing. And the explosion had killed quite a lot of U.S. sailors. So there's a lot of real deep anger in the United States and calls for revenge, basically, in early 1898. And McKinley uses this to basically push the United States into war against Spain. McKinley's message to Congress is basically that, quote, all expedients of diplomacy have been exhausted with Spain. Basically, he says, I've been trying to negotiate with Spain for a year, 12 months. They're not listening. They're not giving in anything. So I've tried everything I can, and now we have this kind of apparent kind of terrorist attack against an American ship. So he basically asked Congress for a declaration of war against Spain, to not just help the Cubans win independence, but we now know also to attack other Spanish colonies around the world. So Congress gives approval, votes for a declaration of war, and in return Spain declares war on the United States in April 1898, and so the United States and Spain are at war against each other. And the first place that the United States wants to attack is basically Cuba. So the United States sends a fleet of warships to Cuba, basically destroys the Spanish fleet, that's the few Spanish boats that are around Cuba, pretty quickly in June and July, and then will block any future Spanish ships from accessing Cuba. So the Spanish troops that are in Cuba are going to have to win the war on their own because they're not going to get reinforcements. And it's not so much the U.S. Army that goes into Cuba, but actually the former Secretary of Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, basically raised a private militia of volunteers, not even U.S. soldiers. And they got together and got some official-looking uniforms and some flags, and they're basically a private militia that the United States government allows to enter Cuba to fight against these Spanish troops. And that's exactly what happened. They invade in July, and Roosevelt and his attackers basically attack some Spanish fortifications. The most famous one happens in July 1st. And those Spanish forces surrender by the end of the month. And then the U.S. Army invades Costa Rica, which was another Spanish colony at the time in Central America, and conquers that from Spain without much resistance at all. And Spain has basically lost this war pretty quickly in just a few months. And Roosevelt becomes a war hero out of this, and he's going to launch his political career. And in the next U.S. election, McKinley will nominate him for vice president. So Roosevelt is becoming very famous off this stuff. And you're going to get a series of peace negotiations in Paris between basically the U.S. government and the Spanish government. Cuban leaders aren't even really there to negotiate their own independence from Spain, which is pretty extraordinary. So the eventual peace treaty that is signed in Paris to give independence to Cuba in 1898 Also, at the same time, gives the United States the power to occupy Cuba, which it will start doing by the end of the year. The United States Army will move into Cuba and start an occupation and disband the Cuban army completely, the Revolutionary Army, and start allowing U.S. businesses to come into Cuba and start buying up a whole lot of land, especially sugar plantations. The U.S. occupation builds a lot of infrastructure for Cuba: schools, roads, sewer systems, communication lines like telegraphs, but largely hires U.S. businesses to build that stuff. So you see a pretty close integration between kind of the infrastructure for a future Cuban economy and U.S. businesses themselves. And as the Cubans are sitting down to write their constitution, which they will finish in 1901, the United States allows the Cubans to write their own constitution as long as the Cuban constitution includes what becomes known as the Platt Amendment. And this is a big famous thing that gives the United States a lot of very powerful rights in Cuba. So number one, the United States government will basically dominate Cuban diplomacy, which is foreign policy, and will dominate fiscal policy, which means money. So the United States government will basically tell the Cuban government what its tax policy and its money printing policies will be, and what its foreign policies will be, what allies it's going to have, what treaties it will sign, those types of things. The United States in this Platt Amendment also gets the right to lease naval bases in Cuba, and in order to basically keep a permanent U.S. military foothold in Cuba on Cuban land. And the area that the United States government's most interested in becomes known as Guantanamo Bay, where they will build a major naval base. So the U.S. Navy will be stationed in Cuba ever since. And the third big power the United States gets over Cuba is the Cuban Constitution says explicitly that the United States gets the power to intervene at any time in Cuban politics in order to preserve, quote, order and, quote, Cuban independence. So the United States government gets the power in the Cuban Constitution to send in the U.S. military into Cuba in order to influence Cuban politics whenever the U.S. government decides that Cuban independence or just basic law and order is under threat. And the United States government will use this power repeatedly into the 1900s. But a lot of historians argue that the United States has basically, through these powers, colonized Cuba, even though Cuba is not an official U.S. colony or territory or anything. Cuba is officially an independent country with its own government. And so this Cuban Constitution is completed and ratified in 1901. The Platt Amendment is in it. And so in 1902, they're going to have their first presidential election. One of the big revolutionary leaders and generals named Tomas Estrada Palma is elected Cuban president in 1902, even though he was staying in the United States at the time in New York. So he mostly won the vote, even though he's not even in Cuba, because he is mostly nonpartisan. He's not a member of any of the big Cuban political parties. He is seen as a kind of Revolutionary War hero. So he's seen, at least at first, as kind of like a George Washington type figure for Cuba. So he tried to stay nonpartisan as much as he could, but he's living in the United States. He's supported by U.S. businesses, and he publicly comes out and says, as Cuban president even, that Cuba should become part of the United States, to eventually become a state of the United States. So he and his advisors worry that Cuba is not strong enough economically or militarily to maintain its independence and survive a possible Spanish counterattack to recolonize or any other European power's attack to colonize the island. But just the fact that he has publicly said that it's in Cuba's best interest to become a part of the United States over the long term really angered a whole lot of Cuban people and voters. So when he was up for re-election in 1905, the only way that he is able to get re-elected is through massive voter fraud. And it's pretty blatant and pretty obvious. The opposing political party who ran their own candidate against him in 1905 were so angry about this that they started a new kind of Cuban revolution in 1906 that forced Palma to resign the presidency. And that's when the United States will start a new occupation, it says, to rebuild political stability for Cuba for the long term. So another U.S. occupation will get going in 1906, just 4 years after the last one ended. So the United States basically imposed a new government, set up a new governor to run the place. They held elections that were, again, massively fraudulent because the United States ran the elections basically and made sure to get their favorite person elected president. And again, U.S. businesses are still coming in and buying up more land, more territory, more of the economy. And another election happened in 1917 for another president, which was, again, massive voter fraud. And again, the kind of Cuban parties that lost declared another revolt, basically. And that starts another U.S. occupation in 1917 that will go to 1922. So the United States occupies Cuba 3 times within 20 years. And these occupations go on for years. So every step of the way, U.S. businesses are taking greater and greater control over Cuba. And a lot of ambitious young Cubans have trouble getting good-paying jobs in these U.S. businesses because the U.S. owners want to hire U.S. workers and U.S. bureaucrats to, run their businesses in Cuba. So ambitious Cuban men can't really go into the business world to get rich or pull themselves out of poverty or whatever they're trying to accomplish. So a lot of them instead go into politics or they join the army. Which makes politics in Cuba very corrupt and the army often unreliable. And the United States for itself will follow similar policies in the other colonies it took from Spain in 1898, Costa Rica, Puerto Rico. But the United States doesn't formally annex those areas or make them into states, largely because of U.S. racism. They don't want to suddenly be responsible for, a couple million Puerto Ricans that would suddenly become U.S. citizens if Puerto Rico was made into a state. But a lot of this stuff in the United States is not controversial. A lot of Americans just accepted that this should be done, and a lot of U.S. businesses are making a lot of money. It wasn't a very difficult thing for the U.S. to run these occupations in Cuba, Puerto Rico, or Costa Rica. It was much more difficult to do so in the Philippines, which, if I can get my cursor going, is way out here, another former Spanish colony that the United States took control over when the United States conquered these colonies and defeated Spain in that war in 1898. So that's where the Philippines are. And the United States didn't really let the Filipinos kind of create their own constitution or government or anything. The United States just basically ran the Philippines as a U.S. territory and would continue to do so into the 1940s. But this is much, much more controversial inside the United States because it's much more obvious that the United States is ruling the Philippines as a colonial power. They're running the Philippines basically as a colony. So there's a U.S. appointed governor over the Philippines. The U.S. government bureaucracy runs the Philippines. So it's not like the Filipinos even have a constitution or any real elections themselves for their own society, like was at least happening in name in places like Cuba. So in the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there's a big anti-imperialism movement, and they basically argue that the United States should not become an imperial country because the United States was born out of an anti-imperial revolution against Britain, and that the United States should instead kind of define itself as upholding equal rights for everybody and self-government and democracy, and you just cannot do that when you rule over people as a colony, because if you don't give them the right to vote, you're governing over them, so you're basically oppressing them. So there's a lot of anti-imperialist and very famous ones in the United States at the time. There's also a lot of pro-imperialist in the United States who argue that people like Filipinos are kind of lower down on the evolutionary scale. So there's a lot of racism involved. These darker skinned peoples, these natives, don't know anything about democracy or Western style government or capitalism. So they can't be trusted to elect their own leaders because they'll just destroy their own society. They'll vote in bad people who don't know what they're doing, and it'll be really, really bad. So the pro-imperialists say basically we should keep places like the Philippines as a colony and run it for them until there is enough time to like civilize them and introduce democracy to them and show them how it works so that they can vote responsibly and they'll have a better government for the future. But of course, a lot of that is also obviously based in just racism against these natives. And the last area we're going to talk about today is what becomes known as the Panama Canal. So we've seen on the map before, if I can get my cursor again, Panama, as we know it today, is down here at the kind of southern end of Central America as it connects to South America. Panama in the late 1800s was not a country all by itself. It was a province of the larger country of Colombia. So Colombia owned all of what we see on the map now and also owned this land sticking out going up into Central America. So the big reason that we're talking about this here is that the United States has been interested in building a canal really since the early 1800s to move its navy from its eastern seaboard areas, its east coast, especially since the mid-1800s. They're going to want to have a west coast navy also, and they don't want to sail all the way around the southern tip of South America to move from one coast to the other in case of attack. They want to build a canal somewhere through Central America to get those boats through much faster. And as we've talked about before, U.S. businesses and the U.S. government's number one target was to build it through southern Nicaragua, kind of along here where the lake is, and there's kind of a couple of rivers that go up to the lake. That was not successful. There was a French company that was negotiating, actually even got permission, a contract in 1878 to build a canal somewhere in this area of Panama. So they got that contract from the Colombian government. A U.S. company was also trying to build a canal through the Nicaraguan area around here in the 1890s. But when the kind of financial crisis set in 1893, that basically bankrupted both of those companies, the U.S.-based one that's working in Nicaragua and the French-based company that's working in Colombia. So a lot of things start to change once President McKinley comes into office. So McKinley enters office and goes into 1898 with this demand against Spain and conquering all these colonies. And so by the end of 1898, McKinley and U.S. leaders are looking at the map saying we have all these colonies spread all over the place in these different islands now, and we're going to need a canal to move the U.S. Navy very quickly from one area to another. So his idea is that just the reality of the U.S. strategic position with all these colonies, the United States is going to need what he calls a two-ocean navy, one U.S. Navy kind of pointed toward the Atlantic Ocean and another pointed toward the Pacific Ocean. And they're going to need a canal somewhere in Central America to move those navies back and forth if necessary. So that's really one of McKinley's next big projects after the war against Spain is over. McKinley is re-elected president in 1900. His vice president is now Roosevelt, the big kind of nationalist hero of the Cuban invasion. And as McKinley is negotiating with Colombia to try to get this done, he's actually assassinated in September 1901. So that made Roosevelt president of the United States suddenly, the youngest president that the country has ever had so far. And Roosevelt is completely an imperialist. He wants the United States to grow to be the most powerful country in the world. And he is willing to basically do whatever it takes as necessary to accomplish that goal. So Colombia at the same time, starting in 1899, is basically going through a civil war that in Colombian history is called the War of 1,000 Days. So that war goes until 1903. It's a giant mess that we won't get into the details of. But basically, Roosevelt wanted to use that civil war in Colombia to gain some leverage over the Colombian government to get permission to build a canal somewhere. So Roosevelt sent his representatives to the Colombian government to try to negotiate some type of deal to allow a U.S. business, a U.S. company, to go in and build a canal. And the U.S. government would pay for this, and basically the U.S. government would, and Colombian government would sign a contract with a private U.S.-based company to build the thing. The problem, though, is that Colombia's legislature, the lawmakers, rejected all of the deals that the Americans offered because they're afraid of losing control over any area that they allow a canal to be built in. The Colombians are not dumb. They know that if the United States, or they believe if the United States gets a canal built, that the United States isn't going to be happy to just have permission to use the canal. They're going to want to control it, which means they're going to want to control the land around the canal, most likely. So the Colombian government's not willing to sign a deal with the United States, and that angered Roosevelt to no end. So Roosevelt instead directed a bunch of U.S. spies and whatnot to help create a Panamanian revolution to break Panama away from Colombia, make Panama into an independent country. And even sent, as the Panamanians start talking about this as a good idea, this Panamanian revolt will get U.S. money and supplies, and eventually Roosevelt will send in the U.S. Army to the border between what eventually becomes Panama and Colombia in order to stop Colombian troops from getting into Panama and ending the revolt. So this is a direct military intervention and encouragement of a Panamanian revolt in order to get a deal with the new Panamanian government. And what do you know, right when Panama declares independence, the United States recognizes Panama's independence in November 1903 and immediately starts negotiating a canal to be made. So the United States Secretary of State opens negotiations, interestingly, in Washington, D.C., and not with the new Panamanian government or its representatives, but instead with a French engineer and company to get a canal built. So the treaty they eventually agreed to is that in return for the U.S. having helped this Panamanian revolution in 1903, the United States gets the right to hire a company to build a canal, and the United States also will be able to control land within 10 miles of the canal. So 10-mile wide swath of land that you see here on the map in this kind of pinkish area. And this becomes known as the Canal Zone. that the United States government will control, quote, in the treaty, quote, in perpetuity as if it were sovereign. So this is basically the Panamanian government giving this land, this canal zone, to the United States government, and the United States government will basically own it as if it's part of the United States. The United States will pay $10 million up front for all this, and then pay another $250,000 annual fee to be allowed to use this canal once it's finished. So both governments approved this deal in 1904. They signed a contract with the canal company in 1907. And construction starts. And construction takes a very long time because there's a whole lot of problems. It's basically seen as one of the great engineering feats of the world for its time. So it takes several years to build the thing, but it's finished in 1914, and it opens and it works. And the United States wants guaranteed control over the canal zone, wants to guarantee that the Panamanian government will always allow U.S. ships to, pay their fees and move through. So the United States government makes deals with the Panamanian government to support the Panamanian government as long as there is a certain group in control to run the Panamanian government that will guarantee U.S. access to the canal whenever it wants. So the United States basically will support a Panamanian elite dictatorship that oppresses the Panamanian people, who are by and large pretty pissed off at this deal and will remain so for many years. So the U.S. government needed a dictatorship in Panama to keep the people under control, so that the people can never demand any changes to this deal, and the U.S. will get access to the canal whenever it wants. And that's the basic deal that will stay in place for nearly 100 years, right up into our own time. So we'll stop here for today. We'll talk much more about Panama and the canal and Cuba and the long-term results of this first kind of U.S. foray into imperialism, especially in Latin America. But this will have major long-term results for the development of not only the United States, but of Latin America in general. The Panama Canal becomes a big symbolic thing to all Latin Americans, and they see how this unfolded and they'll learn from it. And there will be resistance movements to U.S. dominance in other parts of Latin America as a result. So we'll stop here, and next time we'll talk more about the United States using its economic power in the early 1900s throughout Latin America.